Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Gaza, your host for today, and this is Zuni, my co-host.
Assalamu alaikum.
Before we invite our author, I'd like to say a few things about Refaat Alareer. He's a professor of world literature and creative writing at the Islamic University of Gaza and the editor of Gaza Writes Back, short stories from young writers in Gaza, Palestine. He earned his MA in literature from University College London. We are lucky to have an author from Gaza, and we could ask him about Gaza and the wonderful people who are there. He does give us a glimpse of various places on there, like Khan Yunis, Rafah, and others, and I'm sure we would be interested to know more.
Honestly, that sounds so inspirational. It's such a pleasure to introduce you, Refaat Alareer.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm really honored to be here to talking to brothers and sisters in the UK. I spent about a year and a half of my life in London, Manchester, and Salford myself. I did my MA in comparative literature at UCL and SOAS. I spent like a year in Little Venice. Not sure if you heard of Little Venice in Harrow Road, near Jewel Road and Paddington Station. Again, speaking about Palestine, speaking about my experience as a Palestinian who was born and raised under Israeli occupation. 4 decades of my life I spent under Israeli occupation. I became a student, and then I became a teacher, and then I became a husband and a father, and all these experiences, whatever you take for granted, are experiences that are marred by what Israel dictates upon us as Palestinians. Even traveling from one place to the other is if it's possible, it's mostly impossible. But if you can do it, it turns into a nightmare. I was born in Gaza, but I have never been able to go to Jerusalem. It's just 1 or 2 hour drive from Gaza to Jerusalem to Al-Aqsa Mosque, but I can't go there. And millions of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank cannot go there because Israel will not allow them, because they are Palestinians, because they're Muslims. And the same thing applies to traveling outside of Gaza. Usually you are sent back, you are harassed, because Israel wants us to remain imprisoned in this little space that is Gaza's strip. Israel doesn't want Palestinians to go out and connect with people outside, to reach out. And with this in mind, every aspect of our lives as Palestinians is impacted and influenced by the existence of the Israeli occupation. Whether you have a kid, whether you get married, whether you want to go to school, and for God's sakes, whether you want to buy a book. After 2006, when Israel imposed its horrible siege on Gaza for over 5 to 6 years, Palestinians were not able to buy books. If you wanted to buy a book, Harry Potter or whatever book that is out there, it wouldn't get to you in Gaza, because Israel wouldn't allow the mail to get into Gaza Strip. Now, as a Palestinian, as a father, as an educator at university now, I have chosen early in my life to invest a lot into telling the Palestinian story. As Palestinians, and I think this applies to most people, but in Palestine, we have something special about stories. We are born and we are raised on stories, to cherish stories, to love stories, to seek stories. And at the same time, we are taught early in our lives to tell and retell these stories that we hear from our grandparents, especially our grandmothers, and from our parents, especially our mothers, because it's usually the female in the family that is like virtually, so to speak, in charge of the stories that wants to make sure and to guarantee that the Palestinian story, that the story lives and outlives every other experience. And that's why we grow up appreciating stories. And personally, I've been blessed, I've been lucky to have a wonderful mother who told me so many stories in my lives. And these very stories are the stories that shaped me, that made me the person I am now, the stories that inspire me to continue, the stories that teach me the moral lessons, the stories that connect me to my past, to how my parents lived under Israeli occupation, how my grandparents even also lived under Israeli occupation. This is the beautiful nature of storytelling. It connects the older generations with the younger generations, and that's why, as a Palestinian, we feel obliged to tell the story. If the story stops, if we don't narrate the stories to others, the stories are going to die, and thus we're going to betray our heritage and our not only our past but also our future. And what makes stories also important to us as Palestinians is that Israel does not want these stories to get out, because when occupiers control the land of a particular people, like the case with the Zionist occupation in Palestine, they want to occupy the heritage. Israel has stolen all sorts of Palestinian foods and Palestinian heritage. Now, most of the food you see listed as Israelis, not Israelis. They stole it, even the stories, and the very particular special stories about Palestine, about what happened before the Nakba, because and that's why when we tell stories to the people, they are usually shocked because they don't know, because they were not allowed, they were not given the chance to listen to Palestinians talk about the calamity, the experience. In the early 20th century, Palestinians under the British mandate occupation, they welcomed Jewish immigrants from Europe. They welcomed them and they gave them refuge and shelter, because we understood what it means to suffer from discrimination, and that what happened in Europe in the early 20th century, in the 30s and in the 40s. We gave refuge because as Muslims in Palestine, and by the way, and this is something I like to highlight all the time, there are millions of Palestinian Christians. I think around about 30% of Palestinians in Palestine and outside Palestine, in diaspora, the refugees are Christians. And there are still Jewish Palestinians who lived in Palestine before the Israeli occupation. So Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted, and to a large extent peacefully, lived side by side. It was until the Zionist occupation, Zionism, decided that no, this land, all of Palestine, is ours. We don't want to let the native Palestinians to live here peacefully as they have lived for generations and generations. And that when Israel was established, so many things about Palestine were destroyed. Israel dismissed and kicked out close to 1 million Palestinians from their villages. Israel, the Zionist gangs destroyed over 400 Palestinian villages, kicked them out. And they were not allowed to go back to the land of their ancestors, to the land of their parents and grandparents. And until this moment, there are about 7 million Palestinian refugees, some of them internal refugees in Gaza, Jerusalem, and other areas of the West Bank. And millions are refugees outside in Europe, in America, in Latin America, in the Arab world, and in other places. So as Palestinians, we understand that Israel wants to kill the Palestinian story, not only to kill Palestinians, to eradicate the Palestinian narrative, to tell the people what Israel wants the people to hear. And this happens in literature, and it happens mostly in mainstream media. And that's why, for example, Palestinians have always resorted to using social media platforms. And also that's why Israel is interfering in, pressuring these social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Twitter to censor and to delete Palestinian content. Why is that? Because when the Palestinian story gets out, when people see and hear for themselves what's going on in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and other areas of Palestine, people realize that Israel has been lying all along. Israel has been fabricating all along, and that the Palestinians have the right to exist, and that Israel is not only against the Palestinian resistance. Israel does not want the very existence of Palestinians. And during the war, I was asked on the BBC, why don't people in Gaza stop the rockets? I said, this is what you're doing is wrong. You're framing this in a wrong way, because the rockets in Gaza are about 10 years old. Before the rockets, Israel killed and occupied and dismissed and destroyed. In the West Bank, in Jerusalem, there are no rockets. There is no armed struggle in Jerusalem and in the West Bank like there is in Gaza. And Israel is still killing and dismissing Palestinians, stealing their lands, uprooting their trees, especially the olive trees. The settlers come from London, from Brooklyn, from New York, from Brazil, here and there, and they just want to take our homes and our lands. So if you think that Palestinians are the aggressors, it's because you don't want to see the reality, to see truth. And this is why we Palestinians say we need Palestinians, have always been speaking. A lot of people would be saying, no, enable Palestinians to speak. No, we can speak. As not only this, again, what I'm saying here applies to all peoples around the world who have been oppressed, people who are discriminated against, whether Black people, Black Lives Matter, the movement, and the people, the suffering, indigenous people in America, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, people who suffered under occupation, like in Kashmir and other areas, the Rohingya, in Syria, around the Arab world, everywhere. People can speak. It's usually that they are not given the chance to speak. They are silenced. They are muted. And in the past last month, when Israel started this horrible 11-day campaign of atrocities, more and more people started paying attention to Palestinians and listening to Palestinians and realizing that the Palestinians are fighting a racist, settler, colonial entity, a racist occupation that is not only destroying Palestinian lives, but also every possible thing that would give Palestinians the chance to survive. So in this context, as a Palestinian educator and father, I insist on telling the story. I insist on using this beautiful form of resistance, non-violent resistance, as part of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, for basic human rights. And I remember, if I want to move to talk about Gaza Writes Back, in 2008 and 9, Israel started its first major war against Gaza in decades. It killed over 1,500 people in 23 days. Most of them were Palestinian children. Whole families were killed, massacred under the rubble of their homes. Women, elderly people, young people. And during that time, there was this campaign of demonizing Palestinians, presenting them as pure evil to the world, in the media and everywhere. And Israel was also waging a psychological war against Palestinians. They were saying that when Palestinians go out, they're not going to realize Gaza. Gaza is going to be totally different because of the massive destruction. And there was a lot of fear. That was about 12, 13 years ago. I had little kids who hadn't started school yet, and you could see the fear when 23 days of non-stop bombing. What are you going to do to tell your kids? How are you going to protect them? As a father, your most sacred job is to provide love, to provide security, safety, food, future. to your kids. But as a Palestinian, Israel does not give you this. It's a privilege. So what I did then, I started telling my kids stories. Shayma and Omar and Ahmed was a little like 3 years old. I would bring them around me and tell them stories and stories, a story after story, a story after story. And it was at that moment that I saw this beautiful connection and beautiful impact of stories, because I started telling them stories that my mother told me, and then stories that my grandmother told me, and then I started making up my own stories, and then I started asking my kids to make up their own stories, and I saw this beautiful thread, magical thread, how the generations, the great grandmother, the grandmother, the father, and the kids, how they are connected in this beautiful, magical thread of stories, a thread that gives them peace and hope and beauty amidst the death and the destruction that Israel was bringing on the heads of Palestinians, killing over 1,400 Palestinians. And then I decided that when this finishes, I want to do something about it. I want to write down some of these stories. And I also, when I go back to my classes, to university, I want my students to write down and to write back. Because if the story is just only an oral story, we enjoy it, we tell it to each other, but what about the people out there? And because I teach English literature, I went back to my students. It was horrible. Everyone of Gaza had relatives killed by Israel, or injured, or hurt, or their house destroyed. And amidst this suffering and pain and despair, I said to my students, listen, I want you to write stories as part of the class assignment. I'm talking here about university students in their senior students. And as you expect from students, and as there was an approach, they were like, we have never written a story. What do you expect us to write about? This is our first experience. You know how students resist, always don't want to do assignments, don't want to do different things. But I had a vision, and I said, listen, I promise I'll be there for you, to support, to give you tips, to help you, to read, to give you feedback, to tutor you, to monitor you, to everything. I'm available 24/7. You just write the story. And the story, there are no limits, there are no rules. Just write a story. Make it a short fiction with a beginning and the main events, the complications, the climax, possibly if there is a climax to the story, and then a possible kind of a resolution, an ending, if there is an ending to the story. And we started together, and I saw, because I knew my students, and I was very close to them, and I saw how they were, all of us are filled with stories. You don't have to be a Palestinian. Everybody is actually a collection of stories. And it's the stories we hear every day that shape us. And now, at the end of the term, about 98% of the students submitted their assignments. That was unprecedented, unexpected. Even the students themselves did not believe what they did, just produced. So out of these 100 stories, I read them, I give them feedback, and I listed them, created a short list of the stories that can be published. And these stories are written in English. I'm talking about students whose first language is Arabic, who study English literature at the Islamic University of Gaza. And later on, 2 years later, I was contacted by a publisher, an American publisher, a small publisher called Just World Books. And she asked me, Refaat, she said, Helena Coban, she said, I saw your blog and I want you to turn it into a book. What do you think? I said, I have a better idea. She said, what is it? I said, I have an idea of a book of short stories, a collection of short stories. And because people are like, they want to understand the politics of Gaza. They want articles, they want, analyses, they want opinions. And she was reluctant in the beginning, so timeless. Stories break the barriers, all kinds of barriers, psychological, religious, gender, geographical, barriers of time and place. Stories are timeless, and that's why even now we enjoy reading Shakespeare and Chaucer. We enjoy these stories. Beowulf, we enjoy that story 1,500 years later. And we started working on the book, and it took us about a year and a half. It's not an easy job to get a book out, but finally we had this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. I'm not saying it's beautiful because I edited this book and contributed to. It's because of how it was received around the world. The book consists of 23 stories, and the 23 stories, why 23? Because of the 23 days of atrocities and war and aggression and massacres by Israel. So we wanted to say to the world that Israel destroys and kills and massacres, and we Palestinians, we write, we plant hope, we create stories. We're gifting this beautiful gift to the world, a book of stories. You read them, however you react to them, you live with them, and you retell the stories to others. And the most interesting thing is that most of the writers are female. And this is interesting in many ways. We have 15 writers, 12 of them are young Palestinian girls, young Palestinian women. And that tells us something about the society and Palestinians. And I always said this, like here, even in local community, I say that Palestinian women have to be given the chance, more space, their rightful space to produce and to give and to talk about Palestine, to write, to work for Palestine. And there will be real change. And hopefully women take more and more space as we go on. And we wrote, people always ask us, why did you write the book in English? And the answer is simple. We wrote it in English because we understand that English is the language that most, that millions and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people speak around the world. We wanted our message to get out to people who don't know Arabic, because our Palestinians and Arabs, we know what's going on. And sadly, our Arab neighbors have not been helpful. The individuals, the people, the masses have always been amazing and wonderful supporters of Palestine, but not the regimes, not the rulers, not the politicians. They've always stabbed us in the back again and again and again. We don't trust them. So we chose English because we wanted as many people, because we have a moral obligation as Palestinians to reach out to the world, to tell them that this is our story, to tell them that this is what's going on in Palestine. And the stories are, the book here says like short stories from Palestine, short fiction. They're not imaginative. They're not all, like Harry Potter kind of writing in terms of how it's magical and everything. Stories are based in realities, not necessarily the realities of the writers, but the realities of their own people. And not only, by the way, in Gaza, but also in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the rest of Palestine. And also many of these stories, and I'm sure some of you read this. If you haven't, please try to read the story, the book. Many of the stories don't mention time, place, or even names of characters. And this is very significant because we believe that the stories are timeless. This could happen in Yemen, in Kashmir, in Myanmar, could happen in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, anywhere around the world, in the Arab world or in the Muslim world or anywhere. So there was this message about you read the book and you don't know where this takes place. Gaza, Jerusalem, West Bank, and this is the beauty again of how literature, how this book brings all Palestine together and brings all humanity together. And the book was a success, was published again in America, and it was translated into Japanese in part, was translated into Malay, was translated into Italian, into Turkish, into Persian, into Bengali, and published. It was translated into Arabic, but still it's not published in Arabic, and it was turned into an audio book. And this shows again why stories are important. Now, what I want to talk about here in the remaining minutes is again how stories also connect peoples, like I just said, and the struggles around the world together. When I started the book, I opened it with a quote by a Nigerian author, Chinua Achebe. I hope you heard about Chinua Achebe. You have to read Chinua Achebe. He's a Nigerian novelist and thinker. And I did this deliberately because in the introduction, I wanted people to understand that Palestine is part of the global struggle against racism, against discrimination. To support Palestine is to be anti-racist necessarily. All forms of racism are rejected. You need to be to fight Islamophobia, like you just mentioned, misogyny, racism, anti-Semitism, all sorts of racism. So Chinua Achebe says in the quote I used from Chinua Achebe from his novel, The Ant Hills of the Savannah, storytellers are a threat. They threaten all champions of control. They frighten usurpers of the right to freedom of the human spirit. And this happened to us as Palestinians. There is a Palestinian female poet called Fadwa Khan who passed like 20 years ago. There is a very famous quote by an Israeli general who said that Fadwa Khan is more dangerous than 20 Palestinian commandos. Why? Because this Israeli general understands that being a poet, writing for Palestine, threatens Israel. Because Israel wants people silent, occupied, kneeling, submissive, and Israel wants to control the story. It doesn't want anybody to write poetry or stories. And only just 5 years ago, there is this Palestinian poet called Dareen Tatour, and probably you can hold a meeting with her. She published her diaries just last week. Dareen Tatour is a young Palestinian poet who was arrested by Israel for writing poetry. She was sent to prison. She spent years in prison and under house arrest for writing poetry. And that's why we insist that people write their stories. And again, there is another important quote by Chinua Achebe who says that if the lions do not, let me just get the exact wording. If the lions, okay, where is it? If the lions do not have, until lions have their own historian, the history of the hunt will glorify the hunter. Until the lions have their own historian, until the oppressed, the occupied, the weak, the wretched, the vulnerable, until they have their own historian, the history of the hunt, history is going to glorify, because it's the winner, the victorious, that write the history. And that's why we need to challenge this. We need to change this as Palestinians. And in the introduction to Gaza Writes Back, I insist on how important this thing is. But before I read some of the quotes and see then some of your questions or input, I want to quote something by Murid al-Barghouti, who passed this year. Murid al-Barghouti wrote, "I saw Ramallah, and I was born here, I was born there." He's an amazing Palestinian, was an amazing Palestinian thinker and writer. He says, "It is easy to blur the truth with a simple linguistic trick. Start your story from second." Yes, this is what Rabin did. He simply neglected to speak of what happened first. Start your story with secondly, and the world will be turned upside down. Start your story with secondly, and the arrows of the Red Indians are the original criminals, and the guns of the white men are entirely the victims. It is enough to start with secondly, for the anger of the black man against the white to be barbarous. Start with secondly, and Gandhi becomes responsible for the tragedies of the British. And this is why this story is as a book that says firstly. You want to listen to Palestinians? Start from firstly. Don't start from secondly or thirdly or fourthly, because this is what Israel does. They usually present like what's going on in Gaza as a conflict. It's not a conflict. It says, look, they're firing rockets in Gaza. But yeah, this didn't start last week, last month, or 10 years ago. It started 73 years ago. It started in 1917 when Britain gave Palestine to the Zionists on a silver platter. I'll recite, I'll read short quotes, and then I'll stop if you have questions or if you want to say something. The first quote says, there is a Palestine that dwells inside all of us. A Palestine that needs to be rescued, a free Palestine where all people, regardless of color, religion, or race, coexist. A Palestine where the meaning of the word occupation is only restricted to what the dictionary says, rather than those plenty of meanings and connotations of death, destruction, pain, suffering, deprivation, isolation, and restrictions that Israel has injected the word with. And another quote that I really love, and I consider it to be a summary of the whole story, and something it's my motto in life. When people tell me, what's your personal quote? I say, this is my personal quote. It says, sometimes a homeland becomes a tale. We love the story because it is about our homeland. And we love our homeland even more because of the story. And this is what Gaza Writes Back is trying to do. This is what we as Palestinians try to do. We want to turn this into a story, because stories are sought. Stories are loved, appreciated, and cherished, because stories live, and stories give voice to the voiceless and face to the faceless. Stories humanize the politics. Stories remove the barriers. And that's why a book like Gaza Writes Back was translated into 7 languages: Japanese, Turkish, Italian, because people love to read stories about other cultures and about other peoples. And when you read these stories, you think of yourself, what if I were this person? What if this little kid is mine, my own kid? Because there are stories about little kids who are buried under the rubble. There are kids. There is the first story, my favorite story, is Ill for Life, about a little girl whose father was snatched from her home before he completed the story. And she spent the whole story here trying to find the ending to the story that her father was telling her. A student who wants to be a doctor, but her father was killed. Their house was destroyed. A story about a Palestinian freedom fighter killed defending his land, his refugee camp. About a Palestinian little kid running after a little bird, but shot by Israeli settlers. About Palestinians whose house was taken away from them, confiscated, and they can't go back to it, they can't take it back. These are the experiences that we want the people to know. And we want the stories to live in them, and we want them to tell and retell the stories as much as they can. Okay, thank you. I hope I covered the things you had in mind, and I'll be really very glad to take some questions.